Hello there, Little Masters, and welcome back to the Prancing Pony Podcast, where today we're welcoming back to the Common Room a guest we just couldn't get enough of the first time around.
So much so that we're already bringing him back on the show for the second time this season. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First of all, I'm Shawn Marchese, the real-life Lord of the Mark, and I'm here with the Man of the West, who's come back for more wardrobe tips, Alan Sisto.
Oh, ouch, that one hurts, Shawn. Well, folks, in case you haven't figured it out, and that last little bit might do exactly that, or if you haven't, read the title of the episode, today we are welcoming Brian Sibley back to the podcast. If you've been keeping up with us, you know he was one of the many guests we spoke to at Tolkien 2019, back in episode 136.
And we said then that we hoped it wouldn't be his last appearance on the show, and he must have felt the same way. But in case you missed his previous appearance, well, go listen to that. But if you did miss it, Brian is a multi-award-winning author, screenwriter, and radio playwright. He's written many books and over 100 hours of radio drama.
And he's perhaps best known to you, as our listeners, as the co-writer of the acclaimed 1981 BBC radio dramatization of The Lord of the Rings, as well as the 1992 radio plays of Farmer Giles of Ham, Smith of Wootton Major, Leaf by Niggle, and The Adventures of Tom Bombadil.
He's also written more books about Middle-earth and Middle-earth-related media than we could possibly list here, but they include The Lord of the Rings, The Making of the Movie Trilogy, official movie guides for Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit trilogies, and a number of collaborations with John Howe, such as the maps of Tolkien's Middle-earth.
And he's not just a writer. He's given his voice to his own radio productions and audiobooks, including the audio documentary J.R.R. Tolkien, An Audio Portrait, and even performing the role of the giant in Farmer Giles of Ham. Not to mention BBC dramatizations of C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia.
And speaking of Narnia, he's also written works on many of your other favorite fantasy worlds, including Harry Potter, His Dark Materials, the works of Disney, and, oh, bother, Winnie the Pooh. And we'll be asking him about everything we have the time for today.
You're just looking for an excuse for that Pooh impression, weren't you,
Anytime.
Anytime. Well, folks, let's stop talking about what we're going to do and start doing it by letting our guests say hello. Brian Sibley, let me say once again, welcome to the Prancing Pony Podcast.
Well, thank you so much. It's lovely to be here. It's great to talk to your listeners and to you, Shawn, and you, Alan. It's great to be with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we are going to jump into questions in just a moment. But before we do, I want to remind our listeners that if you want to find out more about any of the works of Brian Sibley that we'll be talking about today, please check out the official library page of our website, theprancingponypodcast.com, and we'll have links there to every book we've mentioned on the show.
And there's a lot of other great stuff on our website, too. There's show notes and book links specific to each episode, including a link to Brian's own website and blog. We've got outtakes, we've got Prancing Pony Ponderings, we've got a few other little extras there.
Yep.
You'll also find a link to our new online storefront at teespring.com/stores/PPP, where you can find shirts, mugs, stickers, and other great Prancing Pony Podcast gear. So please check that out.
And now let's go ahead and get to know Brian a little better. Now, in your first appearance with us just a few weeks ago, we asked you the question that we ask everybody who comes on the podcast, when and how you discovered Tolkien's work. You told us that you'd read The Hobbit at 11 or 12, but that you had a little bit of trouble getting into The Lord of the Rings until about 10 years later. After trying to crack the prologue for years, you finally just skipped it and went straight to chapter 1 and were hooked by the end of that chapter. Tell us a little bit more about that experience. What was it in the first chapter that hooked you? And did you think this might be a work that you'd end up spending so much time with for the rest of your life?
Well, I certainly never thought the latter. I couldn't possibly imagine that. I was, as I think I mentioned last time, I was lying in hospital at the time. I wasn't very well.
Right.
Had a duodenal ulcer and I had to lay absolutely still, bed rest. And so a big book was just what I needed. I think really what captured me in that first chapter was just the essence of The Hobbit, what I'd loved about The Hobbit when I'd read it so many years earlier. And I think it was just that homely, parochial feeling about the Shire, which Tolkien captures so perfectly.
Yeah.
One of the things that people ask me quite often what I do. You may be indeed about to ask me that a little bit later, but people sometimes say, which of the chapters and episodes in The Lord of the Rings did you most enjoy dramatizing? And the truth is that the episodes I most enjoyed really were all of those ones centered around those intimate moments, the bag end opening, the whole opening of the Shire, the early journey, and those chapters at the end. So I think that's probably what captured me. I mean, it was just like picking up The Hobbit again. Of course, I discovered, as every reader does, that as you carry on reading The Lord of the Rings, of course, the whole tapestry of the story opens up and up and up. It becomes more complex and more deep in its essences. And so, of course, by that time I was completely hooked in, because the personalities, those personalities of Frodo and Sam and Gandalf are so strong in those early chapters that you really can't get anything but caught up in the essence of it.
Absolutely.
Well, and now you've been a Tolkien fan for many decades, and you've been an active member in organizations like the Tolkien Society. You've seen a handful of different media adaptations appear, including your own. And of course, now we're on the edge of a new one coming out from Amazon.
Yeah, that's exciting, isn't it?
It is.
It is. We're
Yeah.
looking forward to that.
I know we've got a lot of listeners just, watching all the news, asking us our opinions about the news and everything. Yeah.
Yeah, people keep asking me whether I'm involved with it. Are you? And I keep saying not yet, in the hope that the message might come through.
Maybe Amazon will say, "Oh, well, yeah, we should
hint,
probably get that Brian
Amazon, I'm available."
Well,
they've
got Shippy. They don't need me. So.
Yeah, true. Well, I'd love to hear from you, Brian. How have you seen the fandom change since you first discovered Tolkien's works as a young man? And what impact do you think that films and radio adaptations and all this other media have had on that change over time?
Well, I think when I first encountered Tolkien fandom, and I was quite early in on the early days of the Tolkien Society, which is, well, heaven help us, 50 years ago this year. I think my perspective was probably different to the outsiders. Mine was that of a fellow fan. But I think that people outside of that fandom really looked upon it as really rather nerdy and quirky and a little bit kind of off the wall and not really, something to be taken seriously. And what I find surprising, it's not surprising. What I find really interesting and encouraging, actually, is that, within those 50 years, we've now moved to a point where in poll after poll, The Lord of the Rings has registered as being one of the great books of the 20th century.
Absolutely.
And where people now respect Tolkien as a writer in a way that I don't believe they did back then. There was a television documentary made in Britain during Tolkien's lifetime where the people presenting the program were talking to these slightly hippie undergrads wandering around in Oxford, and the whole essence of it was that this is a sort of little internal world of people who are just interested in this very, very particular piece of literature, but actually not even literature in a way. There wasn't that regard for it. And I think partly it's due to the fact that Tolkien as a writer was not a novelist. I mean, it's one of the things I love about the books, and it's also one of the things that's most deeply frustrating if you're trying to work with them in terms of a dramatic project, because he wrote just as a storyteller, telling stories to please himself, essentially, I think, and of course his children in the early days. So he didn't have any of those structures or pressures that the novelist, in inverted commas, has to worry about, and indeed didn't have a publisher who was going to be breathing down his neck saying, you can't say that, or you must do that, or that's structurally not the way you write a novel. So he just wrote in that way. But of course, what you get with that is the immediacy of somebody who is telling a story just as it comes to him. And I think we really value those kind of books that are told almost extempore. They just come. I mean, Alice in Wonderland is another example, completely different scale, different subject, but it's a story that just got told, and it was told in a way where, when Lewis Carroll and the three daughters of Dean Liddell were rowing down the Isis in Oxford, none of them actually knew where that story was going to end when he started telling her the story. And you get that feel very strongly, of course, in The Lord of the Rings, particularly in the early chapters, certainly the first half of the book, where everything that happens is happening to the characters, and you are discovering it, and actually you kind of suspect, and we now know, that Tolkien was discovering it at exactly the same time. And that immediacy, it's a real immediacy, which I think is, well, for me anyway, one of the most powerful factors about the book. And I think in the early days, people looked at the books and they said, "Oh well, they're this funny kind of thing that some young people are interested in," and probably associating it with substances which probably people shouldn't be indulging in.
Right. It had that reputation. Yeah.
Well, yes, quite. But now we've come to a position, I think, where we can actually assess it much more as a piece of literature. And of course, people are doing that. There's hundreds of books, thousands of books, I'm sure, about Tolkien as a writer, not just as
That's right.
the myth or the films or anything else.
Absolutely.
I'd like to ask a follow-up question to that. You just said that immediacy is more prominent in the first half of the book. Do you feel that it loses some of that immediacy as Tolkien gets deeper into the story and kind of maybe as he's getting deeper into the larger world of Middle-earth that he had in his head for much longer?
It transitions, I think, Shawn. It changes into something different, but the progress of that transition is such that you go with it and you accept it. I mean, one of the things that I find hard about The Hobbit is that kind of sea change from when you reach the Lonely Mountain and suddenly everything becomes more heroic and more ennobled, and the story about the little people, particularly Bilbo's story, and the smallness is kind of almost overwhelmed and assumed in the bigness of the story. But I think that never quite happens in The Lord of the Rings, for the simple reason that even as the greater story unfolds and you realize the true stature, say, of Aragorn and the power of the majesty of the king and all that it represents. And even as the language gets elevated, because Tolkien's language changes, of course, through the book quite dramatically.
Right.
What you still have as a touchstone are those other characters. You have Frodo and Sam and let's face it, Gollum, who are earthing you back into those characters, and Gandalf too, and Merry and Pippin. So, all of that is keeping you in the story, which is centered on the people, the characters themselves. The big events, I don't think ever totally overshadow, however big they get, and you don't get much bigger than the Battle of Pelennor Fields. But so those huge events are immediately contrasted with what's going on with Frodo and Sam and Gollum at the crack of doom. So, the big and the huge is always rooted in the small and the particular. That's why I think it was. But the tone does change.
It
Shawn,
does.
you're absolutely right.
Yeah. That's a great observation, by the way. And I'm looking forward to kind of observing that in the show ourselves, Shawn. We'll have to make note of that. I mean, we've already talked a little bit about that tone change from book one
book one to book two, right?
Yeah. But I think we'll see more of it even
will
more
continue to progress.
Absolutely. Well, shifting gears a little bit, we want to talk specifically for a while about the famous work, the BBC radio dramatization. We've got some questions there. That's, of course, what our listeners are probably going to know you best for.
Sure.
So you told us in your last appearance that you pitched The Lord of the Rings to the BBC very early in your career, and you ended up being paired with a more experienced writer, Michael Bakewell, on the project. So what happened then? Writers aren't always that involved throughout the production process, right? Were you? What kind of interaction did you have with cast and crew, and what was your role during production?
Well, my role during production was a bit of a thorn in the flesh of the director, but I'll come to that in just a moment.
Okay.
I was very fortunate because I had no real expectation that I would ever secure this job. It was a kind of mad stab in the dark that I thought I might get somebody to say they were interested, and then I ended up being responsible for structuring all 26 half-hour episodes and then for writing 13 of them. And I may have mentioned this before, but I was inordinately lucky because Michael Bakewell, who, as you say, was a very experienced writer and producer as well, he'd also dramatized War and Peace for BBC Radio. So he'd got a real grasp on how to handle big books and big stories. And he was so gracious. Michael was still alive, but I think that perhaps he just saw saw in this eager young guy something that he thought, well, whatever happens, he's bringing great enthusiasm to it. And he did me the great courtesy and service of just saying, well, you do what you want, basically. When it came to how we divided up the 26 episodes, and I thought, well, what do we do? Do I do 1 to 13, and does he do 14 to 26? And he said, no, just take whichever ones you most want to do. I think, which is a nice offer.
Right, sure. Yeah.
I was old enough, even if not experienced enough, to know my limitations. And we were talking a moment ago about the Battle of Pelennor Fields, and I had not the faintest idea to work just working in sound as to how to create those kind of scenes just orally. I didn't know. I'd no idea how to go about it. I'd never written anything like that, and I'd no concept of how to set about doing it. So I tried to be sensible. I tried to say, yes, I'd love to do all of that stuff there, some of the best stuff with Gollum, actually. But actually, that also means I'm going to have to do these great cataclysmic battles and rides and things. And I'm not going to, I don't know how to go about it. So I really sorted the episodes in a way that gave, well, frankly, the hardest stuff to Michael. And I took the easy stuff for myself. After we'd written it, Michael, of course, being so experienced and really having done so much himself, didn't feel the urge to be in the studio every day. I did. And, I had done so little, and here was one of the biggest things ever going to be recorded.
Right, sure.
And so I just wanted to be there the whole time. And I did become a complete nuisance to the producer. Because she quite rightly, and I now understand, I've been in many studios since, and most producers are happy to have me in the studio, but I absolutely behave completely differently, because now I always listen and wait until somebody asks me what I think. But what I would do there was, there's a scene unfolding, and quite clearly Michael Hordern as Gandalf hasn't quite understood a particular line, so there would be a sharp intake of breath from the writer who was sitting immediately behind the producer. And she wasn't quite sure whether that was the actor or somebody in the studio had taken a sharp intake of breath, or no, it was me. Or I would immediately start saying, regardless of the fact they were still recording, I would say, no, he's pronounced that wrong. That's not how you... And frankly, I think it was about 7 or 8 episodes in, and the tension started to show. But what I did in the end was, I'm going to make this sound as though I had any choice in the matter, which I absolutely didn't. I ended up being in the BBC every day that it was being recorded, but I sat in a green room, another room adjacent. I didn't sit behind the producer's chair, which was, in fact, very wise. As I said, now
that's great.
Most recently, when I was working on a dramatization a couple of years back now, but about Of Watership Down by Richard Adams. The producer and I sat side by side, and I've learned now that one of the things which is a very sharp learning curve as a writer is, if you're working as a writer, you're working in isolation. And so I still do when I'm writing anything, whether it's prose or a drama, I'm saying the words out loud, either literally out loud, like I'm talking now, or within my head. And I can hear those voices. If there's lots of characters, I have my own, as we all do as a reader. When you're reading a book, you have an internal voice that you hear. Now, the moment you go into a studio and an actor comes in, first of all, he or she has a completely different voice often to the one that you had in your head. Every now and again, there's a real synchronicity. Hordern and Woodthorpe were 2 examples of voices that were as close to my internal hearing voice as they could get. But other voices, Robert Stevens as Aragorn, for example, was completely unlike the voice in my head. But it's not just the voice. The actor will read a line and take 3 or 4 different actors, they'll all read a line differently to each other.
Exactly.
And
Right.
indeed, if you have an actor like Ian Holm, with whom I was working because he was playing Frodo and, of course, later played Bilbo in the film, Ian's whole way of approaching acting is that I never give the same performance twice. So, and which is, it has to be said, not always easy for his fellow actors, because every time there's a new take, he will give a different reading of the line. So sometimes, you know, in your head, particularly if you've labored over this for a long time, you absolutely know which word is going to be emphasized by the character when he says what he needs to say. You know where those you know where those emphases are going to fall, and of course, an actor will read it completely differently.
Of course.
And I've now learned after some years, I've now learned to listen, and sometimes, if you listen with really open ears and try not to keep tuning into the voice in your own head, sometimes you get some extraordinary surprises, you know, and an actor suddenly plumbs a depth in something that you've written that you had absolutely no immediate realization was there. So that's the difficulty. And it was a hard learning curve for me because I hadn't had the experience. But you know, it's a valuable one, because you have to learn that your voice, as the person who's writing it, is only part of this whole team of people that are bringing it together, and that involves you know, the musicians and the sound people and the sound effects, and you know, so that was hard. It was hard, but I mean, at the end of it, and there are still moments now when I listen to it where things are wrong. You know, I'm not going to tell you which.
Well, of course not. Well, scratch that question, Shawn.
Yeah, but there are things that are wrong. I mean, which are absolutely, literally wrong. Like there's a line where somehow Aragorn was referred to as king, as it should be, King Alessa, and was weirdly described as king of Alessa. No idea how that "of" got in there. So there are those kind of mistakes. But there are still, for me, lines which every now and again I think, no, that's not how you say that. That's not right. But by and large, I mean, with a cast like we had, for me, it was just, and it still is when I hear it now. It's I'm so far away from the process of having written it now that I tend to hear it completely differently now anyway. So
that makes sense.
and I don't listen to it inordinately often. So, you know, when I meet these fans who say, "Oh, I've listened to this 20 times," and I go, "Good grief, I've not listened to it half that." You know, so there we are.
Well, and for you, it's probably that, you know, that thing you did in your youth that you know, you're so far from now.
Well, yeah, that's true in a way, except that I never view it in that way, because I did go through a period, if I'm honest. I did a lot of things afterwards. You mentioned Chronicles of Narnia, and I dramatized all 7 of those books. And actually, in terms of the amount of work and the length of the project, and I did that project on my own, that was actually longer than what I did with The Lord of the Rings, actually, in the whole length of The Lord of the Rings. So it was a much bigger project. And other things like the Gormenghast novels of Mervyn Peake, which I think was probably one of the finest pieces of work I've done. I don't actually think much about what my work, what the worth of my work is, but I do think that there was a time when I was really, I think, really wanted to get rid of this label, if I'm totally honest, because every time I did anything, people went, and Brian Sibley, who dramatized the well-known BBC, and I used to think, yes, but I've done this and I've done that, and it felt second-hand because it wasn't an original thing. And I've learned 2 things now. That I've learned that one of the gifts that I had, and I don't know where it came from, but which I've been able to use, has been to try and not translate so much as take a literary form and make it into something which can be heard and experienced orally, and that ability is itself of some value. And I've also realised over the years, and it comes home to me every time I go to something like the celebration of the Tolkien Society's 50th, that this was a work which, and it's not down to me, it's down to everybody who was involved. It's a work that has affected these huge numbers of people. You know, a guy who spoke to me when we were all there up in Birmingham and said to me, I had terrific dyslexia problems, and it was through listening to the radio version that I then started struggling to work my way through reading the book. And as a result of it, he's now, well, perfectly established as a writer and somebody who is
Wow.
a living proof that dyslexia doesn't need to hold you back in life. And to think that this production, of which I was a small part, had any effect on him or the many other people who've said complimentary things about it to me, that's beautiful, actually. And so I'm now very happy to own that label that
Mm.
once upon a time bothered me. But that may be just because I'm getting so old now that I'm not going to do anything much more, much bigger. So I can just rest on that and say, yes, I love doing that. But I did love doing it. Yeah.
I bet.
Yeah.
I bet.
So I do want to take a step back and talk about the cast a little bit more. You've mentioned some of those names already, and it really was a truly impressive cast that was assembled for that. So this was a 1981 production, and it really showcased a variety of British talents, some who were already established at the time. I know you just mentioned Michael Horton, who played Gandalf, Robert Stevens as Aragorn, and then also some actors who were sort of up-and-comers at the time, but have gone on to become very well known. You mentioned Ian Holm as Frodo, Bill Nighy as Sam. Do you have any favorite stories about the cast? Some of these well-known names that you'd like to share, or that you can share?
Can share is probably the important part, right?
That is slightly, yes. Well, yes, I think one of the brilliant things that the producer Jane Morgan did was to try and find voices. Well, she was adamant at the beginning that she didn't want voices that sounded like they were supposed to be some other kind of creatures. And I think she was absolutely on the money there because, of course, what Tolkien, once you're into the story, you don't really keep thinking about the fact that what the Hobbit looks like and his hairy feet and all of that. You're just, they are just characters because they are, all of them, aspects of humanity. And she quite wisely, I think, say in comparison to the soundtrack of the Ralph Bakshi film, where they tried to give the hobbits what they thought might be kind of hobbity voices a little bit, and she never did bother with that. They had to be real people, and I think by choosing Ian, who was sort of really, well, he was an established actor, but had not perhaps reached the peak of his later career, but particularly with the casting of Bill Nighy, or William Nighy, as he was then calling himself. He wasn't Bill back then. That was an inspired piece, and his performance, which seemed to, in rehearsal, I seem to remember, it was just there, complete and entire, and it never, ever varied. He just somehow got Sam and everything that Sam represented. And I think the relationship between him and Ian Holm, who was a much more experienced actor, so for Bill, it was very much a learning curve too, I think, because he was acting with actors who were in many ways giants compared with where he was in his own career. That he never got overpowered by them or overwhelmed by them. Not that they would set out to do that, but I mean, he was always held his own in all those scenes, and what he brought was that immense sense of compassion and honesty and warmth that we love Sam for in the book, and he just somehow got it, and it was there instantly in the voice and in all those relationships. And I mean, for me, I think probably those episodes on the way up to Mount Doom, which I dramatized. Those moments, and also in the episodes that Michael did, which were set in Shelob's lair, those moments where the relationship between those two it comes so alive, and it's so personal because it's just focused on these two small characters against overwhelming odds. So I think that was brilliant casting, and similarly with Merry and Pippin, the voices for Merry and Pippin. If I think of the relationship between Legolas and Gimli, played by David Collins as Legolas, he had a light voice. It wasn't. It didn't sort of set out to be a kind of elf voice. It wasn't kind of fluting or fairy-like, but it was a light voice set against Douglas Livingston's gruff Gimli voice, was just perfect. And that relationship, which is another relationship in the story that I love so much, the way in which their relationship develops and this strong bond and affection grows up between elf and dwarf. All that was, I thought, magically captured in the story. I
Yeah.
suppose if I'm going to tell a story about anybody, it would really be about Michael Hordern, because the thing about Michael was that he instinctively understood what Gandalf was. I mean, it was just he just did it. He was one of those actors, and I've seen him play a lot of different roles in comedies and dramas and so on. But whenever he plays a role, somehow he just does it. And I think there are actors who are like that. He always talked about the fact that he only got the part because Sir Ralph Richardson turned it down. And that was never the case, but it was typical of Michael that he would be so self-effacing as to pretend that he only got it because one of the great knights of the English stage at that time, of course he was knighted himself later, but one of the great knights had turned it down. That's how he got the part. But he truly never, ever understood what was going on. I mean, he just did not know. And yet somehow when he's talking to Frodo in the opening episodes, well, to Bilbo first of all, and then to Frodo about the ring, when those passages are going on and he's bringing out all this history about what's gone on in Middle Earth in the past, and Sauron and Mordor and all the rest of it, he truly had no idea, but he somehow managed to say all that stuff as though it made sense to him. You know, I mean, I don't know what the trick was that he used as an actor, but he said it with such authority and such power that you thought, well, gosh, yes, the one ring to rule them all. Gosh, that sounds frightening. And yet, if you'd asked Michael, he wouldn't have had a clue what it really meant. He never read the book. I mean, there's no obligation on an actor who's got a script. That why should he necessarily need to read the book? Ian Holm had read the book. David Legolas had read the book, and several others, and they were often a kind of they went back to the book and brought things out from the book, and sometimes they'd say, well, you know, it says this in the book. Why is that line not there? Or how should that be played? Because I've read that it says this. But for Michael, it was just, here's the script. I'll read it. I'll do it. And of course, because we recorded these over a period of 2 months, he just waited for the next script. He didn't look ahead. Well, he didn't see them actually, because they were being typed up and given to people, you know, 2 weeks at a time. So he had no idea when he did episode 1 what he would be doing in episode 26. Had no idea at all.
That's amazing.
And I have told this story many times, but there was a point when, having fallen from the bridge of Khazad-dûm at the end of that particular episode, with the echoing line, "Fly, you fools," as he disappears into the darkness, that he trailed into the producer's booth in the studio and said, "Jane, rather concerned, Jane. My agent said I was in 16 episodes, and I seem to have died in episode 8." And she said, "No, it's all right. It's all right, Michael. You're resurrected in 3 episodes' time." And he said, "Oh, splendid, splendid," and sort of just toddled off. But you know, just presumably in his mind, going, "Oh, right. So I'm just resurrected. Oh, it's that resurrection thing. Yes, I'll do that one. Yeah, no, that's number 43 in my book of voices." But nevertheless, when I hear it now, and you know, I love Ian McKellen's film performance, of course. But you know, in comparison with Ian, who knew the book, read the book, was obsessive about the book, in comparison to what he was doing necessarily from the script, Michael had no such kind of help given to him. It just came from within his own internal brilliance as an actor. You know, he just that's what I am. You know, that is just what I am. But at the same time, he wasn't putting on a magician voice. I mean, I think I'm not saying that Ralph Richardson probably wouldn't also have been splendid, because he was a very similar actor in that sense, that I think he was a totally intuitive actor. But I could imagine if say John Gielgud had got the part, for example, John Gielgud would have been wanting to be, you know, he would have had his images of Prospero and all the other kind of magical entities that he could think of, and he would be bringing all that to it, where Michael just brought, well, what they all brought, I think, which is why it's endured, which is humanity. You know, regardless of hobbits, dwarves, men, wizards, they all had that kind of humanity. And and I think because a lot of the actors were very seasoned radio performers. So you had people like James Grout, who, if anybody of your listeners know the Morse stories that have been filmed by the BBC, you know, the Inspector Morse and the Endeavour series and those books. Well, he played in Morse. He was the superintendent policeman, and now he was Barlam and Butterbur, and he was just perfect. You know, he just brought to that part, small part, but he just brought that bumbling kind of character. But you love him, and you know that even though he's totally incompetent, he is actually a good guy. He's on the good side. You know,
Right.
So there were lots of those performers. Peter Howell, who played Saruman, I thought his performance, which is small really in comparison with the other parts, but absolutely captured the kind of the sneering, superior quality of Saruman, and the treacherousness of him too. The moment where Gandalf confronts him, and that's another scene I adore, where he says, you know, I am now Saruman of many colours. And there's just that moment, and then Michael Hordner's Gandalf says, "I preferred white," and you know, which I love it in the book, and I love that. So those actors brought a great, vast experience of career work to tiny parts, often, you know, and in doing so, they fleshed out these little characters that we didn't have time often to do a huge amount with in terms of script, because we were trying to compress so much into a small space of time. But at the same time, they brought to it that authority that they had earned through playing many, many parts across many years, and particularly radio actors, because, as I think I've probably said elsewhere, is that obviously the radio actor has got nothing to work with except their vocal cords. You know, if it's not in the voice, and how you pace it and say it, and the emphasis and the loudness or the softness, if that isn't in your voice, then it's never going to work. It doesn't matter how many films you've made or how many stages you've walked across. If you can't bring it all down into that microphone in front of you, then you're lost.
Well, that is so true.
If I could mention one final scene, just that really impacted, well, it's not one of many, but the one which I think I remember most powerfully, because I was looking into the studio through a sort of observation window. This is after I'd got kicked out of the studio.
They moved you out. Yeah.
So I was pressed up against the glass like a child looking into the Christmas window, you know, peering between my fingers. But there was, we were on the brink of Mount Doom, inside, and there's an amazing moment in the story where Frodo is weakening, and you know, he thinks, you know, he's struggling with, is he going to give the ring? Is he going to hand it over? And just at that moment, just before Sam throws himself at Gollum seizes Frodo's hand and, of course, bites off the finger with the ring. And at that moment, Woodthorpe, and there wasn't much love lost, sadly, between Woodthorpe and Ian Holm. I think Ian found Woodthorpe, it was a brilliant, brilliant performance that Peter Woodthorpe gave. But I think he found it so big, and it needed to be big. I think he found it perhaps intimidating. Because Ian Holm was an actor who dealt in particulars, small, intimate kind of nuances of the voice. And the Woodthorpe performance was huge. But Peter seized Ian's hand, I mean, across the microphone. They were standing in a studio at a microphone, and thrust his hand into his own mouth as he was saying the lines. And I remember that moment vividly, and another moment when to the same two actors, where Frodo quells Gollum by pushing him down onto the ground, and Ian Holmes seized Woodthorpe by the shoulders and actually forced him down onto the floor. And I don't think it was just to try and stop him seizing the moment with his acting. No, but they just were they were both so caught up in it that they just instantly acted it out, you know, and to watch it was extraordinary, because there were two grown men and a microphone and cables and a completely empty studio, you know, people standing around in jeans and jumpers and sneakers, but suddenly you were right in that moment, because these two actors were absolutely caught up in it and were living it, you know, before the microphone, and somehow something of that gets captured, I think, in the vocal performance.
I agree. No, it
Absolutely,
absolutely
yeah.
does.
I think those moments really between the three of them, between Ian Holm and Peter Woodthorpe and Bill Nighy, those are I
Yeah,
think some of my favorites in the entire series, and you
agreed.
really do feel it.
All right. So one more question before we move on to a different topic altogether. We understand that you had the help of Christopher Tolkien throughout the project. You sent scripts to him for approval, and he even sent you an audio cassette of him saying some of the names aloud to help with pronunciation. The last time when you were on the show, you told us a little bit about meeting Priscilla. What was it like working with Christopher?
Well, Christopher was remote in that sense because
Hmm,
we were working with him remotely. I mean, he wasn't ever there as part of the production process.
right.
By the time I came to be working on The Lord of the Rings, my understanding of the importance of Christopher Tolkien within the way in which the whole matter of Middle Earth had been put
Mm,
before readers was such that to me, it was very, very important that he was involved
Hmm.
in some way,
yeah.
and that's true of everybody else in the production team because obviously, if he was able to give his blessing to it, and I think he was always rather nervous about doing that in a kind of explicit way. But if there was
Sure.
a sense in which he had an overview of what we were doing, that we weren't going too far off course,
Hmm.
then I think everybody thought, well, at least that we've got him on our side, and that
Yeah.
won't be a bad
Yeah.
Yeah.
thing.
Hmm.
He was very gracious. I mean, because it's so many years ago, I'm finding it rather hard to try and remember very particular things which he
Sure.
might have raised questions about. There were one or two, but they were few, mainly, I think, because uh, we set out to be as faithful as we could be. I mean, we were
Yeah.
boringly faithful to the book, in fact. Well, I mean, in a way, I mean, there were none of the flights of fancy that Peter Jackson and other filmmakers and
Right.
adapters of the books have brought to it. There was nothing of that kind. Everything that I set out to do when I was breaking the book down into episodes was to try and capture as much as I could of the story, but
Right.
of course that meant that there were things that had to go. Famously, of course, Tom Bombadil and the whole of the
Yeah.
episode, Old Man Willow and the Barrow Wights and so on.
Hmm.
So, but there were other episodes that went and other characters that went. I remember talking to Michael and saying there's this character who pops up towards the end called the Prince Imrahil, and he
Hmm.
doesn't say anything, or I think he has two or three lines in the book.
Right.
And we're suddenly going to have to introduce a completely new character, and the character of Arwen, who was an enormous challenge that I don't believe I fully address correctly now. Now I think about it again. But yeah, so Christopher saw the breakdown of the episode, so he saw very early on that we were going to make some of those excisions, and
Mm,
he then read every episode, and there were one or two suggestions that he made, but they were minuscule. He was absolutely not sitting on the project, in a critical way at all, and
mm,
it was a great asset that he made this recording for us, which you mentioned, and to have him sitting, and he did everything. He did all the simple words. So he did Frodo Baggins, the Shire. He did everything that could
wow.
possibly, just
Hmm.
because, in my experience, actors. Well, and myself too, if I have to read something, if there's three different ways of possibly pronouncing something, you'll find
Yeah.
a fourth.
Oh, yeah.
So is it Pelennor or Pelennor? Those kind of
Hmm.
interpretations, and knowing that, of course, most readers who read the book have their own words in their
Hmm.
head, a sound, and that sound approximates it, particularly if they're difficult names. But
Yeah.
is it Khazad-dûm or is it Khazad-dûm, or those
Hmm.
things had to be clear.
Yeah.
We
Right.
needed those things to be clear for the actors and to keep everybody trying to say it in the same way. I do remember there was a couple of instances where I was on the case and saying to the producer, no, X has got that wrong. It's said like this, and she'd say, "Ah, yes, but they're regional characters, aren't they? So there's no guarantee that a dwarf doesn't pronounce it differently to the way an elf would pronounce it," which I suppose is fair enough.
Okay.
Interesting point.
Um,
Yeah.
but there were times when the actors would cluster. I mean, particularly if it was quotations in Elvish and Robert Stevens as Aragorn had a few difficult passages like that, and people would cluster around this little cassette recorder, because we're talking pretty primitive days here, pressing the button, rewind, press the button again, listening to Christopher, and then trying to emulate that pronunciation and get it right. But of course, as you guys know, because it's the same when you're doing anything in broadcasting, you can practice a word or a name over and over and over again. But then when you see it coming up in a paragraph, I've done a lot of presenting in my time, and I've gone over a name of an actor or a writer or something, and it's difficult, but I've learned it. And then I'm reading the link leading up to it, and I can see it coming up the page. I can see this kind of thing that's almost moving on the page and waving angrily at me, knowing that by the time I get to that bit of the sentence, I won't have remembered how it should be correctly said. So
that is exactly right.
All the time.
So for Aragorn, having to suddenly, he could listen to it on the tape, but walk across to the studio, stand at the microphone, and then when he had to come and say it, of course, it had gone completely out of his head. 12 words in Elvish had flown. So, but no, it was great to have. It was great to know that Christopher had an eye and an ear on what we were doing, and to me that was very important, because obviously it was the closest thing we could get to having Tolkien's eye on it. Although I would now shudder to think of how he would have reacted, because we know how he reacted to other people's attempts to dramatize the story.
I'm thinking of that famous letter where he's just eviscerating the Zimmerman script.
Yes, exactly. And I know that he would have been totally intolerant of the fact that I had meshed the stories together after the breaking of the Fellowship, because that was one of his prime arguments, that you had to read the story and hear the story in that order of sequence, and that he'd written it in. But you and I know, and most people who would have listened to it would have known, that's not how you create something dramatically.
Exactly.
So we would have had a terrible row about that, I'm sure. And but Christopher didn't. Christopher didn't choose to have that argument, so that was very good.
That's great. Yeah.
I can almost hear him saying, "The canons of narrative art cannot be completely different."
Oh yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Good stuff.
All right. Well, I'd like to go ahead and move on to some of your other radio work now. In 1992, you went back to adapting Tolkien for radio with Tales from the Perilous Realm. Now, that's a set of works that you brought together for the first time. Farmer Giles of Ham, Smith of Wootton Major, Leaf by Niggle, The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. These are all smaller works. They're known to people like us, certainly, who are very plugged into Tolkien fandom, but not as well known among mainstream radio audiences. I'd like to hear a little bit about what it was like to get that project off the ground with the BBC.
Yeah, I was very, very keen to do it. And the reason I was so keen to do it was because, just to go back in time, we were talking about the fact that there was this huge gap between when I read The Hobbit and when I read The Lord of the Rings. Right. During that gap, I did read Farmer Giles of Ham. I read Smith of Wootton Major when it was first published. As it came out, I read it. I discovered Tree and Leaf, and therefore read Leaf by Niggle, which I loved. I bought a copy of The History of Tom Bombadil, and indeed sent it to Tolkien and asked him to sign it, which he did. So these were books that were beloved by me. And although, yes, they are smaller, so much smaller in scope and essence than The Lord of the Rings or even The Hobbit, but what they have is each of them has something very, very particular about Tolkien and his understanding of the fairy world particularly, and other worlds altogether. So that it was important to me. And to be fair, the BBC were looking for the possibility of something to, let's put it crudely, cash in on the fact that The Lord of the Rings had been already a success. And it seemed to me perfect, because it also gave me the opportunity to try and redress the fact that the Bombadil episodes had been cut out. I've taken a lot of criticism over that from people, mostly from fans, because most other people, anybody who hadn't read the book, of course, didn't know that it wasn't there. And probably at the outrage of some of your listeners, I'm going to say that actually, if you excise those chapters, except that you've got the whole business of where the the hobbits get hold of their blades if you don't
Right.
go to the Barrow-wights.
Mhm.
That apart from that, actually it can be lifted out and you hardly notice the transition. For me, it was very simple, because once you've got the Black Riders on their tail, that is where the drama is. There's no question that the moment they're chasing the hobbits, that the story has to just pursue that is the story you're telling. And if there'd been a digression, even though the digression has in itself threats from Old Man Willow and so on, there is always that threat of, is there something outside the window of Tom Bombadil's house that is looming and threatening? If it could just get past the aura of Tom and Goldberry, and it could attack them, but they're safe in there. So yeah, that's all great stuff. And of course, the moment they're out of Tom's house, they're immediately going wrong again with the Barrow-wight. But even so, although those threats, they're not the same threat as this unknown, mysterious bunch of riders who are pursuing them, which is what's the engine that's driving the story. But it was lovely to be able to revisit it and to use some of the poems from the Adventures of Tom Bombadil to weave into it. And I was very lucky, because I had an actor called Ian Hogg who played Tom Bombadil. And, Tom is a difficult character. Yeah, I mean, to have an actor having to say, hey, dull, merry dull, my darling, or those kind of lines, and make them sound remotely convincing is quite a challenge. But Ian Hogg captured that. He was great. My only sadness about that whole episode was that we couldn't get back Ian Holm and Bill Nye and the other hobbits, so that we could have really made it like an episode that could later actually have been dropped back into the series, like a kind of an outtake.
Plug it in.
Yeah, that would have been nice, but we couldn't do that. But and I love, beyond loving, Leaf by Niggle. It's one of my favorite stories anywhere. And I love it for several reasons. One of which is that, despite all his protestations about never liking allegory and never writing allegory and hating it wherever he found it, that he writes one of the most extraordinarily, exquisitely beautiful allegories about life and death, and of course infused with his own Catholic beliefs about afterlife. And it is just perfection, and the characterizations are so Tolkien. Both Niggle and his neighbor, they are just perfectly captured. So I love that story, and that was special to me. And I also wanted to do Farmer Giles because, in a way, it was a very significant stage in Tolkien's writing development, and there are other things linked into it, like the fact that it was illustrated by Pauline Baynes, and then Pauline Baynes, who became a lifelong friend, well, the end of her life, friend of mine, that she was the person who had illustrated that, and then she had created the cover to that book, with the trees overarching Middle Earth, the big fat paperback of the Lord of the Rings, which had suckered me into the story. So, there were lots of reasons for wanting to do that, and it was just fun to play the giant as well. Particularly as Christopher Davies was being played by Stephen Thorne, who'd been the voice of Treebeard, another great voice in the Lord of the Rings series, and I was able to play a couple of scenes with him as the dragon and he as the giant. So that was fun as well. But and of course Brian Blessed, Brian Blessed, enormous Brian Blessed, as Farmer Giles. He had to stand.
Perfect.
He had to stand about 6 feet away from the microphone, otherwise he would have just blasted it.
Audio engineer holding their headphones like feet away from their head.
Absolutely, yeah. So that was I loved that project, and I have almost got over the bitterness of HarperCollins having purloined the title later. For
our listeners who don't know that, the title "Tales from the Perilous Realm" didn't first come in a book; it came from this radio dramatization. So when you pick up that volume, you have Brian Sibley to thank.
That's right.
Well, but to be fair, I mean, in the same book as Leaf by Niggle, Tree and Leaf, the book's called, of course. In the essay on fairy stories, which is the first part of Tree and Leaf, Tolkien talks about the elements of where that title comes from, because he talks about fairy being a perilous realm.
Right. Yes.
And so I took that perilous realm idea and thought, well, all of these stories, in some sense or other, have something magical about them. It's not all the same kind of magic, but there's quite clearly fairy magic in Smith of Wootton Major. Lovely little story. There's dragons, and therefore the magic of dragons in Farmer Giles, and there's certainly magic in the Tom Bombadil episodes, and then a very kind of spiritual magic in a way in Leaf by Niggle. So I thought, yes, these are all of them tales that come from this place of fairy, which Tolkien understood, and not just understood, but actually spoke about so clearly. If anybody doesn't understand about fairy tales and what fairy tales really mean, and are they, those little sprites with wings that think of like J.M. Barrie's Tinkerbell, or are they something? How do they fit with the world of the elves that we know of in the Lord of the Rings? Then just read the opening. You don't even read the whole of it, but just read the opening pages on fairy stories, and you get a complete understanding of how Tolkien saw the world of fairy and its importance intellectually and in literary sense to us. And so that's where the title came from. But it would have been nice if they'd just said to me, "Hey, Brian, do you mind if we use that title?" But
the answer would have been yes.
I'm almost over it. I'm nearly over it. It's all right. Okay.
It's just really a testament to how great of a title it was.
I had therapy. It's all done now.
Much better.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right, of course, about On Fairy Stories. Episode 1, we actually did On Fairy Stories because we agree with you that it is crucial that if you can get an understanding of that, it really helps you kind of get hold of where Tolkien's coming from for the entire Legendarium. So,
yeah.
And what I love about that collection of stories that you brought together is that each one of them, as you said a moment ago, Brian, each one of them represents sort of a different facet of that idea of fairy, and it's all very different, and it all sort of comes together in Lord of the Rings, but each one of these is sort of a little slice of that.
Yeah, a different approach.
And of course, having Michael Hordern to hold them all together as a narrator through all of them was very important to me, and that was lovely.
That's perfect, and that actually segues nicely into my next question. As sweeping and epic as the Lord of the Rings radio series is, there's an intimacy, an approachability to these dramatizations that I really found wonderful, and I've only recently discovered them within the last couple of years. Partly it's the fact that they're smaller productions of these shorter stories, but it's also the way they're presented. You've got these stories, like you said, narrated by Tolkien, played by Michael Hordern, who was Gandalf in Lord of the Rings, but then acted by the likes of Brian Blessed and Alfred Molina and Niggle. They're touching, they're funny, they're frankly everything they need to be. Do you think this intimacy is a quality of the stories themselves, or did you maybe set out with a different perspective, an attempt to make these lesser-known works a little bit more familiar, a little bit more approachable?
Yeah, I wanted to do that, and I think I saw that all of them. I mean, the one with the biggest dramatic arch in a way is Farmer Giles of Ham, but even as you're reading that story, you know that you're reading something which is not a dramatic story about a dragon that's ever going to sort of kill anybody and destroy. The whole thing is a kind of pastiche. It's almost like a pantomime in a way of a story about a knight who's actually not a very good knight anyway, and isn't really a knight in the first place, and a dragon who, I mean, short of Kenneth Graham's reluctant dragon, I can't think of a dragon who is less dragony really than Christopher Dives. So yes, I wanted to capture that smallness, and in a way, I think it was an opportunity to say that for all the huge scope of the Lord of the Rings, which is vast when you look at the whole structuring of the story that unfolds within it, that Tolkien was also incredibly adept at telling small stories in a very intimate and close way. I mean, I haven't done them, and they weren't part of it. But the Father Christmas letters also come to my mind as being each one singly being has its own little story arch. He absolutely understood how to tell an intimate story, and they feel to me like stories that are told around the fire, or perhaps at the Burden Baby,
Yeah.
over a pint. And there's something about there's a intimate, as you say, but there's also a kind of completion about their completeness, that they don't need anything more, and that made them, I think, in a way easy to dramatize, or easier to dramatize, because the story
self-contained.
was self-contained. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
That's great. Well, also included in the CD collection of Tales from the Perilous Realm is J.R.R. Tolkien, an audio portrait. Now, this was a later project of yours. This was a 2001 compilation of radio and TV archive material about Tolkien. It includes audio interviews with Tolkien himself, as well as appearances by Tom Shippey, Alan Lee, Humphrey Carpenter, Rainer Unwin, and more, all assembled into a sort of audio documentary narrated by you. Now, how did this project come together? And I'd love to know what it was like to put together a story of Tolkien's life out of a mix of new and old audio footage. Did you assemble an outline first, or do you look at the material available and build a story out of that?
I'm trying to remember. I love jigsaws. I love puzzles of all kinds, and this falls into that category.
Yeah.
I was approached with the idea by the BBC, and they said, we've got a mass of this archive stuff. Then they sent me lots and lots of, I think it was actually in those days on audio cassettes. I don't think we were even on disc. I think it was audio cassette. And lots of these cassettes were, of course, immediately I started listening to them, I realized they were completely different in their quality of recording, the quality of what they had been preserved, because quite often there were only bits of interviews, or somebody had said at the end of an interview, well, we must keep all those bits that Tolkien said, but the context of the program wasn't necessarily around it, so I had just stray bits and pieces. So the first thing I did was listen to everything, and then I logged it all. I remember hours and days actually of sitting with notebooks where I wrote down, the in word, like you might do with people don't need to do it nowadays because everything's digital. But I used to write down in ... rather. And then the opening line, and then I'd have a stopwatch and record it, and then measure the time, write down the time, and then I would say what it was about, Tolkien talking about the war or whatever it was. And then having got all these bits and pieces, this jigsaw, if you like, which is just in the form of a series of notes, at that point, I then sat down and thought, how do I arrange this as a story? Because obviously I've got to hold it all together, and there's a lot of things here which nobody's telling me. So there's got to be some narrative flow where I'm talking about where he was born, and then being able to segue into him saying that he remembers what Christmas was for him in South Africa, that kind of thing. So it was bliss, because I really enjoyed it, because I've always, as a broadcaster, I've done lots of radio features and documentaries. The one thing I've always enjoyed is that thing of assembling lots of stuff, whether it's my own interviews or stuff from other sources, and then trying to tell a story through that. So it's a pretty long story, because of course it's a double, I don't know what it is in terms of a CD, but at the time when it was first issued, it was 2 cassettes in a box. So yeah, so there's a lot of it, and it's probably not something you really want to sit down and listen right the way through to. I think it's probably a bit of a hard listen, but and also I wanted to include as much of it as I could. So that was like, it became a kind of challenge. So there were points where I think, no, there's no way I can use this bit of Humphrey Carpenter. It doesn't fit anywhere in here. And then I think, but he's saying something really that I want to use there. So I had to sort of construct reasons for using it. So it was a kind of well, it was a puzzle to put together. But what I was pleased about doing it, I think, is that because it's got some content with people, well, Tolkien himself, obviously, as you say, but people like Rainer Unwin, that there was input from people who were like first-hand witnesses to the story, as well as people like Tom, who is obviously a commentator, and his perspective was also important. And there were other critics and observers within that material. But I also wanted it to try and have, some sense of. I remember as a young man, I bought the gramophone recordings of Tolkien reading parts of his works in that very idiosyncratic way. He'd obviously got the pipe in his mouth, so you kept losing some of the words. You're quite sure, and he always spoke and read at this kind of slightly breakneck speed,
Right.
Yes.
where words fell off the end of the tape recorder. You couldn't actually hear what the word was, but I found them so intriguing. And they, for me, there was a disc. I don't know whether you had it in the States, but there was a disc which was on one side, it was Donald Swan's settings of the poems. Sung by a man called William Elvin, but on the other side there was Tolkien reading some of the verses.
Yes.
And for me, when I heard Tolkien go, "Gosh, no, look," there was suddenly something about hearing that voice,
Yeah.
the voice of the man that wrote it, actually speaking these lines.
Right.
So I wanted to include as much of him as I possibly could. I don't know how it stands up. I haven't heard it for I don't know, years. So I've no idea whether it makes any kind of sense or it's got any value at all nowadays. But I think at the
I'm
time
actually about halfway through it myself. I've been listening to it.
right.
I finally ripped the CDs onto a digital format so I could put it on my
Right.
phone and listen.
Yeah.
And
Right.
I've been enjoying the heck out of it, frankly. It's great. But
Oh,
yeah.
I must go back. I must go back and listen to them again.
I'm kind of a hardcore Tolkien nerd, though. So,
Well, and that's the thing. I mean,
kind of your
I
target
enjoyed
audience.
it. I enjoyed it a lot. I listened to it straight through in maybe one or two sittings, even though it's two
Yeah.
discs. And even for somebody who knows Tolkien's life, it was just a lot of fun to listen to. And
Mhm.
man, just to hear some of the voices that were captured was fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah. It really is amazing. Well, we'd love to talk about your radio work all day, but we also know
Yeah.
that we don't do 3-hour episodes with our guests because we like our guests. So we're going to transition into something else. We also want to talk about your books about the Peter Jackson films. And you've written several behind the scenes accounts of the making of Peter Jackson's films. The Lord of the Rings official movie guide came out in 2001. And then the Lord of the Rings making of the movie Trilogy in 2002. You had the biography of Peter Jackson that came out back in 2006, and even books on the Hobbit films as they were coming out. Assuming you've gotten to know Peter Jackson quite well, how did you first get involved with him and Fran Walsh? And did they reach out to you early in their development of the project, or were you brought on later to kind of chronicle the production?
I think it was a piece of fortuosity, really, because you see, Peter knew the radio dramatizations really well.
Yeah.
He'd heard them as a young man. He had the audio cassettes. I mean, he didn't hear them when they were first broadcast because he's too young to have heard them then.
Well, yeah.
But he had the audio cassettes, and he listened to them on his journey from Wellington to going up to Auckland, where he was going to college, on a coach journey. And that was when he first heard them. And so I think for him, the radio telling, I think it's true that he heard them before he read the books. I think that was very important to his way in which he got into the books.
Right.
So there was a absolute synchronicity in the sense that he wanted very much to find a part for Ian Holm because Ian's performance as Frodo had been so important to his understanding of the books when he'd heard it. And obviously, there was no way that Ian could now play Frodo again.
Well, no.
But,
Right.
but he could play Bilbo. So that's why that piece of casting happened. But the other element was, I think, that it became clear very early on that there was going to be the need to have some, let's put it vulgarly, tie-in books. There was going to be that case.
Sure.
And they'd signed up a deal with HarperCollins, and HarperCollins were the publishers, of course, of Alan Lee's work and John Howe's work. And I'd already at that point written a series of books about the maps of Middle-earth, or started to write that series with John, where, writing them is a bit of an extravagant claim, really, because, in fact, I provided really little more than a gazetteer of what those different places represented that John then depicted in drawings. But anyway, we worked together, and I loved doing those little books, and they were rather sweet, and I liked them. So they were also part of the stuff that Peter was gathering around him when he was doing his pre-planning for the Hobbit, which, of course, I say the Hobbit because he was originally going to do the Hobbit and then the Lord of the Rings. And so he was gathering all these books and map books and so on. So in fact, I saw a kind of pitch film that years later that he had made to try and sell the idea of the film. And there was a shot which ranged across a whole bunch of books. as then printed. I mean, obviously now there'd be a zillion more, but
Right.
and there was the map of the Hobbit map, which I'd done with John, and I remember thinking, and then sometime later when I was talking to John for one of the books, and John said, "Well, you know, this is where it started. It started with our front door." It was very gracious of him to include me in anything to do with that. That drawing, which John made for the cover of that book, is very much the influence for the door, which was built for the set of Bilbo and
That's
Frodo
Right.
in Lord of the Rings. So that I was in on the inside, as it were, and so when the conversation started about, well, who might we get to write the books, the making of books, my name was put forward, and Peter, obviously knowing my name and knowing my involvement with Middle Earth, was very happy with that, and so I think rather like the original Lord of the Rings, it was a very lucky break that I got.
If luck you call it.
Well, I do call it luck, and I tell you why I call it luck, because, and this doesn't necessarily apply to The Hobbit, I don't want to diss The Hobbit, but The Lord of the Rings was a completely different production. I was really blessed because I got an opportunity, like everybody associated with the project, to work with a film company in New Line Cinema who really understood the importance of involving people in a very real sense. And by that I mean that I had access all parts. I wish I'd had better and longer access to Peter, because Peter was enormously elusive, as
I'm sure.
anybody worked on the project will tell you how hard it was to get time with Peter.
Right.
But I could go anywhere I wanted. Nobody's, I just could wander around Weta Workshop, the sets. There was no go area. There was nowhere where anybody said to me, I had no minder saying, no, you can't talk to them, or I want to sit in on the interview you do with this special effects artist, or that makeup artist, or that costume designer. I was just left entirely to my own resources. And that was bliss. And I've never had that. I've done making of books about other films, The Golden Compass, the Harry Potter books, never had that level of access or that level of involvement. But myself and Jane Johnson, who was, of course, one of Tolkien's editors, and writing as Jude Fisher, also wrote tie-in books with the Lord of the Rings, that Jane and I had a level of access which most writers who write about movies would envy beyond envydom. It was just amazing. So when, for example, the film got its first preview at the Cannes Film Festival, we were flown down. Of course, so were many press people, but we were flown down and were given a level of access where the place where we went when we weren't doing interviews or researching or whatever, was the same green room that all the cast were sitting in. So, that's how it was. I remember going to Paris for the premiere of The Two Towers, the European premiere. And I happened to be in the Four Seasons Hotel. I was meeting Richard Taylor, with whom I developed a really close friendship with him and Tanya. And we were going to a fantasy book shop, which Richard went to and then carried out so many books. And only after he'd bought them all, he suddenly realized he was somehow going to have to get them back on a plane to New Zealand afterwards. So that's why I was there meeting him. Happened to bump into Dominic Monaghan, whose birthday it was that day. And Dom said, oh, you're coming to my birthday party tonight, aren't you? They were having a party at a restaurant. And I said, well, I haven't been. No, you're here. No, I know you was come. So, I'm then at a party for a member of the cast seated between Christopher Lee and Geeta, his wife, on one side and Richard on the other. And was treated as though I was just part of the whole company. And in a sense, that gave me, I think, with one particular book, which is the one which is called The Lord of the Rings, the making of the movie trilogy, which I think is the best thing I wrote about the films. Because I had that level of intimacy with anybody, and nobody said at any point, well, we don't want that in the book, or I don't like that, or we'd rather you didn't talk to X, or if you speak to Y, you can only ask this and that, and so on. It was just anything, go anywhere, do whatever I wanted. I mean, the opening of that book, and I'm really fond of it, was that I was sitting, this was just before the premiere of the first film, and we were all in the Dorchester Hotel just prior to the cast going off to walk down the red carpet. And I write in the opening of the book about how a member of the New Line Cinema is schooling everybody on how they are to behave on the red carpet. And and everybody's being told, this is going to be crowds and crowds, and you've all got to get into the theatre, and we've got to watch this film at 2 hours, whatever it was. And, so we haven't got much time. And there was Christopher Lee sitting there and saying, yes, now I've done many, many of these premieres. And if you take my advice, none of you will stop and sign anything. Smile nicely and wave, but don't stop and sign, because if you start signing, we'll be there all night. And anyway, the instructions went on and on and on, and the more and more of this and more of that. And then right at the end, Ian Holm, who was sitting there and hadn't said anything, there was a sort of pause in the conversation. Everybody was sort of taking this in, the taxis and where they had to get out of the taxis and where they had to do and where they had to go. And then there was this just pause, and then Ian Holm said very, very quietly, and the rehearsal is when? And of course, there was no rehearsal. It was like, it's all going to happen in about an hour's time. So,
right.
And I had those moments, and I can't imagine now, and it certainly wasn't the case with The Hobbit. I can't imagine a film company that would have allowed me to use a sequence like that to open a book, because it doesn't fit with what the kind of the media packaging of a film. But for New Line, partly through Mark Odesky, for whom I had the most enormous respect, and Barry Osborne, the producer, with whom, both of whom I had a really good friendship, that they just saw me as being part of the process of bringing this film not to the screen but to the public. So that was lucky, and I loved it. I loved being in New Zealand. I loved the people there. I loved all the opportunities it gave me to do that. The Hobbit was more stressful because Warner Brothers didn't provide the same kind of ambience for people to work with, But and of course, I met all the guys who were doing the backup videos and CD video discs and things. So then I found myself commentating on some of those and being interviewed on others. Or some of them, I would be the person who was sitting in a hotel in London interviewing, after the films were made, Ian McKellen or Christopher Lee at length about, with somebody in Los Angeles and an earpiece saying, ask him about X, Y, and Z, interviews that are even longer than the interviews that we're having. They were like 3-hour interviews with Christopher Lee or Ian McKellen.
Wow.
Which are fairly.
How do we get one of those?
I know, right?
Yeah, good question.
Oh, goodness. Things our listeners would like for $500, Alex.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Well, Brian, when we talked to you last time in Birmingham, you mentioned, and you were talking about the radio series at the time, you talked about the idea that when a team is working on a project, no one involved ever really knows whether they're making something that's going to endure while they're making it.
Yeah.
The Lord of the Rings movies were a huge production. Does that hold true for a big production like that as well? Did they know they were making something big, or was there an ambition that they were making something big?
I'm not sure they did. I think that the moment in Cannes, I remember going to the screening of the sequence that they'd chosen to show, which was pretty much the whole of the Mines of Moria sequence, but it was topped and tailed by some shots of Gandalf arriving in the Shire at the beginning for the unexpected party, or the long-awaited party, I should say. And I think that I remember coming out of that. I remember the Olympia Theatre in Cannes kind of erupting at the end of that 20-minute, I think it was, screening, and just realizing, I think everybody in that theatre knew this is something which is marked with greatness. I think that Jane Johnson and I actually sensed it a little earlier than that, because we were taken, before we started work on anything to do with the tie-in books, we were taken to cinema in Soho and shown a different piece of footage. And it was a clip which included various elements, and it ended with the chase to Bucklebury Ferry and stopped just short of, so you didn't know. Well, I think they get onto this kind of raft that floats away, and that's how it ended, with the Black Riders kind of rearing up on the bank. And Jane and I, and we've both been in our own ways devotees of Tolkien and his work for such a long time. We both came out and knew. I think we looked at each other and we just said, this is going to be something. We just knew that there was something that had been captured, even in what we'd seen was probably no more than 10 or 12 minutes at most of the film. And it was kind of odd scenes, unrelated necessarily. But we just knew there was something, this here was something which was going to be fantastic. And certainly the screening at Cannes made that absolutely known. I mean, my one disappointment initially was that the first book, which I wrote, of course, was written without any access to pretty much anything, because there was very, very, very little at that point. And indeed, it was. I mean, it had to be written it so far in advance. They hadn't even really finished editing the film, and that book was written before the footage had been edited together. I mean, I wrote it in the December of the year before the film came out. So I was working from bits of information, bits of interview that have been gathered together, but it was very, very piecemeal. And really, the book really wasn't, it's hardly in depth. It was really a lot of glossy pictures and a bit of text to hold it together. The next book, the making of book, is one that I'm fondest of. And of course, the third book, which I never got around to writing because I was taken off those books in order to write the biography, and that became an all-consuming kind of monster, which was incredibly difficult, because Peter was never where I wanted him to be. I remember flying to New Zealand, and I arrived in Wellington. I was jet-lagged, and the next day, Peter's assistant said, "Well, yeah." I said, "When do I see Pete?" And she said, "No, you can't see Pete. He's just flying off to London."
No, after the flight all the way to that's brutal.
To supervise the music recording. Well, it wasn't disaster, because what it meant was that I was able, because this was for the biography, so it meant that I spent 3 or 4 weeks where I was meeting all his young friends that he'd been youngsters when they were young people working together, the fans of his, and a lot of the people who were still there working on Lord of the Rings. So I got a load of other material, which was great. But then I came back to London, and I think I had one interview with him after a recording session with Howard Shaw, and then he was back in New Zealand. So in fact, most of the interviews for the biography were done either late. You guys understand this because you operate in the time shift. So it would either be very, very early in the morning my time. Not great first thing in the morning, or it would be very early in the morning Pete's time, or it would be at the end of his day of working filming, and when he's really tired
up for 16 hours and
So it was quite stressful for both of us, actually. But there's a lot of I think in that book, in the biography, I think there's a huge amount in there which is telling the real kind of the amazing story of how the project ever came about, which is it's kind of got forgotten by most people now, but is a fantastic story of the journey from this idea that he had of, why don't I do a fantasy film? Actually, why don't I do the fantasy film?
The ultimate one, right?
Exactly. And then actually succeeding in getting that done and bringing all these people on board, when he was at that time really only known as a rather oddball director of a really kind of the kind of films that you wouldn't immediately say they recommend themselves to be the kind of films that would guarantee a director for the Lord of the Rings. So I'm proud of that book, and because it has that story at its heart. And the one thing I wish we'd been able to do, which we started doing, but it will never be done now, but we did start working together on a kind of diary of the filmmaker's diary, because Peter kept a very clear day-by-day logged, a day-by-day schedule of every shot that he made. And we recorded hours and hours of interviews about that. And the idea was going to be to tell, you know, I mean, obviously a lot of stories about the filming are told within the book, but actually to tell the whole structure of it. But everything was overtaken by other stuff, and it will never see the light of day now. But there's a lot of interviews stashed up somewhere. So.
Yeah,
maybe for the 50th anniversary edition of the film, somebody will dig out those archives.
There you go.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I don't think I'll be around 50 years of the film. But,
no, it'll be like you going through the Tolkien audio archives and kind of thinking, somebody's going to look at this. It's on this round object. What is this? Oh, it's a compact disc. Remember when those were a thing?
Yeah, exactly.
Some great stuff. Well, before we go, I want to ask you about your new Christmas book. After all, this episode is going to come out at the beginning of December, and your new book is called Joseph and the Three Gifts, an Angel's Story, and it was released in September this year. Tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. I was in Venice last Christmas. It's a city I really love. Passionate about the city, and I've been trying for probably the last 4 or 5 years to write a book about Venice. Now the thing is that there are so many books about Venice that the world doesn't really need another book about Venice. You know, there are books about the history of it, there are books about the architecture, there are books, there are cookery books and photographic books, and there are, of course, many novels set in Venice as well. So there's plenty of literature of Venice. It doesn't need another contribution from me. But I decided that I had over the years that I've been there with my partner, we've built up quite a catalogue of photographs of the place, and I was also came across what I thought was a way of approaching it, and that was to do a Venice from A to Z, but not a guidebook because there are so many of those. So it wouldn't be from A for Academia, one of the museums there, to Z for Zatari, which is a particular stretch of walkway along beside one of the canals. But it would actually be about items and things that you might find in Venice. So it might be about people and dogs, or it might be about bottles of grappa in windows, or it might be about clocks, or it might be about bells, it might be about fog or mist or high tide. So it would be a series of little essays, really. And I had been toying with it, and last Christmas I thought, I'm really going to knuckle down and do this while I'm here, just write the odd bit every now and again. And I did write a couple of odd bits and pieces, but then suddenly this story came into my head, and literally in a piece, absolutely given, as it were, which has never happened to me. I was going to say before or since, but there hasn't been much time since, but certainly not before. And the idea really was prompted by the fact that I'd gone to an art exhibition where there was an amazing tapestry by an artist called Edward Burne-Jones, and it's a run-of-the-mill, though it's very beautiful, a picture showing the adoration of the Magi. So there are the three wise men bending, stooping, bowing before Mary and the baby, and there's an angel floating in midair, and it's a very, very detailed picture. And over on the left-hand side of this picture, there is this old man who's coming along with a little hatchet and a bundle of kindling, which he's obviously been cutting in the woods that are behind in order to build some kind of a fire. But he's right on the edge of the picture. And I started looking at other religious paintings and, of course, the Christmas cards that we all get, which show some of those paintings or modern interpretations. And there's always a picture of this character, Joseph, somewhere in this mix in the stable with the ox and the ass and the shepherds and the wise men and so on. But he's this marginal character who doesn't seem to have really, we don't know what his role is. He's not the father of the child. We know that because, he's a surrogate father. I mean, I'm talking about this as though the gospel is a gospel, if you see what I mean. And I started thinking, well, what is this character? What was it like to be this character, having this particular burden placed upon him? And how did he react? I mean, this ordinary carpenter who's suddenly finding that he's got to deal with all of this rather, heavy kind of unknown stuff falling around him.
Right.
And then the second question, which was, what happened to these three gifts, the gold, frankincense, and myrrh? What role did they have afterwards? What did they do with them? Did they take them to Egypt when they fled into Egypt? Did they bring them back again? Did they sell them, give them away? What did they do? So these questions just kept niggling around in my mind across about a month. And then just one day in Venice, I woke up and I just had this story, and I knew it was going to be told by the voice of the Archangel Gabriel, and it was going to tell us about Joseph and the story of the three gifts. And unlike most of the interpretations, the legends, the myths about Joseph, most of which really decide that he was probably in his 60s when he married Mary. So quite reasonably, he would have shuffled off this mortal coil somewhere around long before Jesus was an adult and was beginning his ministry. So in my thought, I thought, well, there's no indication. We've no idea how old he is. So supposing he isn't that old, supposing Mary is 13, 14, 15, she was, by all
certainly
accounts,
young,
was young. But supposing he's not that much older, supposing he's actually late 20s, early 30s, he's still much older than her, still a big age gap, but he's old enough, or young enough rather, to still be alive in another 30 years' time.
Right.
So that's the thinking. And so the story, although it begins in the way that you might expect a story about Christmas to begin, it actually goes right the way through to the Passion of Easter, and Joseph has his own role to play in that. In my story, in my story.
Sure.
So that's how it was and for me, it was one of the most. I don't want to make it sound too mystical, but it was a real curiosity in my life, in that I came back with this story fully written, fully formed, and I thought, I've no idea if it's any good. I've no idea what to do with it. And I happen to know a retired bishop, which is a useful thing to
that would be.
and, so I said to a dear retired bishop, I said, will you read this? And he read it and really liked it, and said, he said, maybe you should put some of this in, and what about that? And there were a few things like that, and I thought, yeah, good point. And then he sent me an email and said, well, why don't you try my publisher? Because he's written a lot of very, very academic books, actually.
Sure.
But he had a publisher, and he said they publish gift books, and they might be interested. Who knows? Why don't you try? So I thought, yeah, well, rather like asking whether I could do the Lord of the Rings, I thought, yeah, why not? So I sent the manuscript off. I just said, my friend Bishop Peter said you might be interested in this. I don't know whether you are. And they wrote back very politely and said that obviously Googled me, found out who I was, and said, oh, yes, of course we know who you are. And, absolutely. Thank you very much for submitting it to us. And we probably need a couple of weeks to be able to think about it and read it and think about it. If that's all right, are you happy to wait that? And of course I was going, well, I'm not doing anything else for the next fortnight. So yes, take your time, please. Don't worry about that. I replied to that. But then I didn't wait 2 weeks. The following day, they emailed me again and said, we've read it, we want to do that, we want it to come out this Christmas, and
that's great.
We're going to do it. And so it was, it was to me, it's been it's about gifts, but it was also to me a kind of a gift. People will make of it what they make of it, but for me, it's something that just came, and it's become something which I didn't expect it to be. So that's nice.
Great. That's wonderful. Great. That's really, really wonderful.
Thank you.
Well, finally, I want to ask, what's next for Brian Sibley? Any big projects in the works, or any projects that are on your must-do list? Besides the Venice book, I guess.
Well, yes, I've got it. Well, I started, but I got sidetracked last year by also, apart from the story about Joseph, I wrote a making of book about a film which Disney are releasing, I think in April, called Artemis Fowl. It's a series of books by a writer called Owen Colfer. You may know of them. Wonderful, magical stories. And Disney have been making a film, but the film, and I always worry but when I hear stories about films going into delayed time, because it usually means there's something somewhere along the line that's not quite right. The film should have come out last September. I mean, the September just gone is what I mean.
Right.
It's
Right.
now
Right.
coming out next. Now it's coming out in April next year, allegedly.
Mhm.
I've written the book. I have a copy of the book. If the film doesn't happen, it may be the only copy of the book in the world. I don't know.
Very rare, very
Yeah,
valuable
very
piece.
rare. Yeah. And as my partner would say, it's not signed, which makes it even rarer. So, so I don't know whether, but at the time I was working, at the time I worked on that, I was kind of taken off another project which I'm doing for Disney, which is editing a book of Walt Disney's letters, and I've got to
Oh,
get back
wow.
into that book. And I've done about a quarter of the book, and it's a fascinating insight into a man
Yeah.
who we haven't touched on it, but I've written quite a lot about Disney and Disney films and the Disney studio, and for me, it's been a real a new perspective on a man that I know a lot about and have read and written quite a bit about,
Yeah.
but a completely different perspective, because these are his letters to, to everybody, to the stars he worked with, to
Mhm.
artists, to politicians, and masses of letters to children. And the letters to children are in themselves just
Oh, I bet.
fantastic, because
Yeah.
he obviously just engaged with kids on a very, very particular and special way. So
Yeah.
that's the next book I've got to do. Other than that, I'm not really sure. Finished the Venice book, and I don't know. I'm wondering whether Gabriel, my angel, I wonder whether he might come back and tell me some more
Oh,
stories. I'm not sure.
maybe.
Some more
Maybe.
adventures.
I'm waiting. I'm just saying that out loud now. Gabriel, if you can hear me.
There you go. Well, whatever the case, it sounds like we've got some things to look forward to. So
I
that's
hope
going to be
so. I
great.
hope so.
Yeah. Excellent.
Excellent.
Well, thank you for joining us, Brian. I am so glad we were able to get you back on the show for a full episode. Thanks for giving us and our listeners so much of your time today. We want you to know how much we appreciate it, and we would be happy to have you back on the show at any time. So please consider this a standing invitation.
Thank you. I accept it willingly, and it's been a joy to talk with you both, and through you both to your listeners. So thanks so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Brian. And folks listening at home, thank you for joining us as well. We hope you'll join us again next week.
But until then, we want you to remember that the talk continues all night long at the Prancing Pony.
That's right. We've always got lots of discussion happening in our social media spaces. At our common room on Facebook, you'll find comments, questions, corrections, and more on every episode, as well as updates from us throughout the week. Just look for the Prancing Pony podcast on Facebook and click the like and follow buttons.
And now we have another common room over on Reddit. You can find great discussions there at r/prancingponypod. And as always, you can find us on Twitter and on Instagram with the handle @prancingponypod. So follow us wherever you might be. And if you like us, share us on Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, wherever you can find Tolkien fans.
And if you really want to let the world know your feelings about us, give us a review on iTunes. The more reviews we have, the more visible our podcast is. That helps others find us and this great community of Tolkien fans we've built together. Before we wrap up, just a quick word from our friends at Mythgard. If you enjoyed discussing fantasy and sci-fi stories, the Mythgard Institute is for you. Mythgard offers a variety of free programs focused on the study and appreciation of speculative fiction.
Mythgard Academy is a weekly book club led by Dr. Corey Olson, the Tolkien professor, to discuss works like the History of Middle-earth series and Ursula K. Le Guin's A Wizard of Earthsea. The Silmarillion Film Project is an ongoing collaborative discussion about an entirely theoretical TV adaptation of Tolkien's Legendarium. And then there's the Mythgard Movie Club. They organize panel discussions about classic and new release fantasy and sci-fi films.
So check out all of the free programs available at mythgard.org.
And finally, folks, if you'd like access to exclusive content like our postscripts for every episode, quarterly specials, Prancing Pony Podcast swag, and more, check out patreon.com/prancingponypod to find out how you can become a part of the Fellowship of the Podcast. For now, though, folks, that is going to wrap it up for another episode of the Prancing Pony Podcast. But please be sure to join us again next time when we welcome some of our patrons to join us here in the virtual studio to put us on the spot in our quarterly Questions After Nightfall.
That is always a lot of fun, occasionally painful for us, and
usually,
and also usually full of unexpected twists and turns. You are not going to want to miss it.
No. And as always, we want to give a very special thank you to our patrons at the Kierdan's contribution tier. That's DeMay in Alaska, James in Virginia, Tamsin in Minnesota, Emily in Texas, Chad in Texas, Lance in New Jersey, Paul in Colorado, Jerry in Texas, Bruce in California, and Mario in Utah. Thank you all so very much.
Make sure you don't miss a single episode of the Prancing Pony Podcast. Subscribe to the show through iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app.
And one last thing, as always, don't forget to send your questions and comments to barliman@theprancingponypodcast.com.
Barliman's not always punctual with the mail, but we'll get back to you as soon as we can. And your question or comment may be featured on an upcoming show.
Folks, this has been far too short a time to spend among such excellent and admirable listeners. But until next time.
Farewell, friends.